like to debate with your camera on, that's fine. If you don't, that's also fine. Just in terms of time signals, I'll be putting 1, 6, 7, and then 7:15, I stop writing. Ideally, you will stop talking. And one last quick request, please be sure to keep yourself on mute if you are not speaking or delivering a POI. Interference makes it very hard for us to judge. I have not, the other panelist has not joined me, so at this point we will only be having Shudipto as a panelist. All right, perfect. So without any further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to open up the floor and deliver a speech not exceeding 7 minutes and 15 seconds. Here.
Awesome. Is anyone having trouble hearing me? Okay, great.
Nope, you are audible.
Awesome. Cool, starting in 3, 2, 1. Lockdown policies made by an overarching central government might sound great in theory, but in practice, given what we know about the realities of these situations that require them, as well as the realities of human nature, we tell you that on our side of the house, you're going to get much more effective, long-term, and able policy for stopping these. First, on the model, we think this probably just sort of generally applies to pandemic medical situations. We can definitely look at our current circumstance in terms of COVID. You can cross-apply a lot of these to SARS and swine flu, although I think on scale, COVID is going to illustrate the magnitude of a lot of these impacts. First thing I want to go over, who is actually able to implement central government lockdown policies and what we think is a more effective way for actually dealing with pandemics. Two things under this. First of all, we tell you that the types of governments that are able to do things like coordinate central federal lockdowns are more likely on the whole going to be autocracies, or at the very least, governments with less things like rule of law and guarantees of civil liberties. Why is this the case? Two reasons. First of all, constitutional guarantees in a lot of other countries make it so that in order to implement lockdowns, you have to go through significant bureaucratic channels and get incorporation from both parties or however many parties exist within your political system, meaning that you have systemic checks. But also, we tell you that within these circumstances, perhaps populaces that are not incorporated under autocracies, you have more popular demand and expectation that your demands are going to be met. That is to say, there are much more abilities for you to channel discontent or frustration, even if you only have an inkling of it with the policy that the government is making you do. But the second thing I want to talk about under this is why we think and what we think the most effective sort of path forward looks like for actually culling these pandemics. Look, we think it basically boils down a lot to individual behavior, right? That is to say, the correlations that we do see between countries are able to effectively stem these things come from things like individual behaviors, like in Japan, which didn't institute a national lockdown, but you still had people wearing masks and willing to social distance and rely on the information that their government is telling them is accurate, which means that they have less things. With that said, for independent constructive, first of all, why do we get more effective lockdown policies? First of all, why on their side of the house do you not get effective policies if you go through the government, right? Three things under this. First of all, these steps to actually institute a political, like a lockdown is tied up in a lot of things like party lobbying or making sure that you actually get legislation passed, especially considering in a lot of places, for instance, the US, it's just not constitutional that you can exert things like executive action to make sure that these instantaneous things happen, right? Even in cases where it's still pretty bad, you still get a pretty crackdown on rights without protection from minorities or certain things, which means you have to go through those channels. It makes it longer that you're actually likely to get anything done and stymied in a second. But second thing under here is that on their side of the house, second wave policy lockdown is basically impossible, right? Why is this the case? Because when you institute something like a first case lockdown, people already, first of all, have an expectation that the lockdown is going to be successful or want to see tangible numbers. But they're also eventually going to reach a point where people are not happy with the lockdown, right? Or there is some sort of public pressure to make sure that these things don't happen. That means that third of all, finally, when you get to a second lockdown, it makes it much more difficult for you, especially if you're working within a democracy or working within a more bureaucratic channel. And note that this isn't even if for that instance, you have to work through these different things, right? But third of all, political incentives, we tell you, create lots of underreporting incentives, whether if you're in an autocracy or if you're in a democracy or in like whatever type of government, right? In autocracies, there's probably those incentives in the first place, but specifically within countries with more bureaucratic means, it's unclear how long lockdowns last and everything, which means that in order to present politically salient populace to your population, also to the members of your parliament or your party, you probably are incentivized to do things like underreport or underrepresent other things. Why do we get more effective then, right? Couple reasons. First of all, we just get better enforcement mechanisms because of like economies of scale, and there's no way for governments to sort of clearly enforce this versus the individual things that states can do. But second of all, it's just much more clear in terms of directives that different states can do, right? That is to say that states can coordinate and tailor their policies to their specific region. They can send out directives to industries that they know are successful within the region, but also states are more finely attuned to the niceties and to like to the intricacies of the industries that go on within the state, right? That is to say, they can do things like tailor specific lockdowns for certain groups that focus more on person-to-person contact while providing stimulus packages or other things, or coordinating PPE efforts to those specific states, right? Second independent argument, on our side, it's just better for people and the economy, right? First, a couple reasons. Lockdown generally means that you don't shut down regionally means that you don't shut down the entire economy all at once. Given we know that this pandemic is a long-term situation, governments cannot afford to shut down national institutions, businesses, schools, and all at once. But regional legislation means that they're able to section off parts of these countries that are in greater dire straits than others, and we only close down those institutions when we absolutely need to. The impacts of this are multifold, right? Which is to say that in pandemic situations, the type of population that is probably more disproportionately affected is going to be a certain population. That is to say, perhaps older people or people with pre-existing medical conditions. But this impact is probably more important because the fact of whether or not you get an income, whether or not you have your job because of COVID, matters to everyone, right, across the entire economy. The vulnerable stakeholders include the most marginalized, and they're better protected under our side when you're able to tailor things and not close economies all at once, lose a lot of jobs that you might not otherwise have lost, and have a lot of debts or a lot of horrible consequences through that, right? Economy doesn't see such drastic ups and downs. Third independent argument is just on backlash, right? Why we think that you get worse policy in the long run. Look, we think when you institute something like a national lockdown, you decrease a lot of faith in government, but also you make it so people are less likely to practice things like individual behaviors. This probably specifically applies within like more legalistic societies where people are more willing to do so, right? Even in the cases where people aren't like, it isn't super legalistic, I think it is still the case that if people think that if a government lockdown is in place, there's less impetus for them to do things like wear masks or other things. But in the case that people don't like the government and don't like what this is doing to their economy, which I think is probably inevitable at a certain point due to the loss of jobs and everything, it means that you're doing things like less likely to wear a mask, you're less likely to listen to government directives, especially when things come out about what you need to do, or the importance of social distancing. Before protected time, I'll take a POI from CO. OO? Okay, cool. I'll go on. Why is this the case? But also why this is worse, in addition to rebelling against lockdown policies, it also means that it makes it that much worse when you actually produce a vaccination, and try to have things like government directives to make sure that everyone uses it or to make sure that other things happen, right? We think in that case, people are much less likely to buy in. They're more likely to listen to things like fake news about how the government is exacerbating this thing or blowing something out of proportion, especially as the pandemic gets exacerbated. But final independent argument is that we think the trade-offs within this are much worse. Right? What are the trade-offs that we think? We think when you devote political time and energy, even if you're not like working legalistically in an autocracy, you're still devoting resources and different things to making sure that lockdowns are enforced. We think it is much more effective instead to direct time and energy to coordinating things like supply channels of PPE and making sure that stimulus packages are able to be passed within your specific Congress or marshaling resources. The reason why this trade-off exists is simply because a trade-off exists, if not only in terms of financial and physical resources, but also in terms of the political capital that you're able to expend in terms of instituting a pandemic, if you're going through those means, and instituting it like lockdown and making sure that it's maintained, but it's probably also less time consuming because these policies take less to coordinate and take less to do. You can get more across. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the Leader of Opposition to open up the opposition bench. Here.
Can I just check that I'm audible before I begin?
Yes, you are.
Excellent. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I'd like to start by clarifying the opposition stance in this debate, because OG has misunderstood the motion, and they're trying to burden push massively here. The motion asks us to defend that federal governments make the decision to lock down. That will be the one to make that decision with the consent of Parliament, Congress, etc. I want to caveat here that they can obviously take local advice. They can listen to what the state government has to say. They obviously don't have to follow it because that would be not meeting our burden. However, we are perfectly fine with regional lockdowns as long as they are decided by the federal government. In fact, I'd say that in most cases, those make sense, right? Look, for example, to most European countries over the summer. They're not federal, but they imposed a lot of regional lockdowns all over the place, particularly when there are like many cases in one place and not in another. I think that makes sense, and that is something we are perfectly legitimate in defending. We don't have to say, oh, national lockdown or nothing, because that makes no sense and is massively expensive, right? Two arguments in my speech. Firstly, how you get more financial support during lockdown for people who need it and corporations who need it. And secondly, how people are more likely to follow the rules because they're essentially less confused. Firstly, though, some rebuttal. Because I think we get this weird point out of PM about how the countries that are able to enforce like swift federal decisions tend to be autocracies, which is just like blatantly untrue, right? I think they've confused making a decision and enforcing it. I think the motion is specifically about the former, right? Whether you need to do it through Parliament, through Congress, or whatever, democracies can easily do that. I don't know if it's unconstitutional in the US for the president to make this decision, but then this debate is probably not about the US, right? I would argue that for the motion to make us argue this, it's probably legal on either side of the House. The question is which leads to a better response to a pandemic. And secondly, I think at the point at which a decision is made, anyone can enforce it, right? Whether it's a federal agency or a local police agency, at the point at which a region is in lockdown, everyone enforces it in the same way that, I don't know, murder may be a federal crime, but a local police officer will still arrest you if you kill someone. Otherwise, they're probably not doing their job right? Cool. Secondly, in terms of this underreporting argument along political lines and whatnot, I think that's entirely symmetric, right? Because even if it's a state governor doing it, they still have to get it like passed through Parliament. They still need to like report cases and justify it. I don't see, if the president doesn't get to be an autocrat, why the state governor suddenly can and why that's fine. The state is probably still a democracy, right? In fact, I would argue that this becomes a lot worse on their side at the point at which you have clashing political incentives, when you can end up in a situation where the federal government is led by one party and the state government is led by another. That is when they actually have an incentive to make each other appear weak and incompetent, and that is when all that stuff you hear out of PM becomes so much worse. But more of that later, because I want to move on to my constructive. How do you get more financial support for people who need it during lockdown? Two bits of framing here that I think are very important. Firstly, note that local governments are already under a lot of strain during a pandemic, whether or not they're in lockdown, right? Because they have to operate testing sites in their local area. They have to deliver food to people who are shielding and can't leave their homes. And they just have to police any sort of regulation you have. Even if it's not lockdown, you just have to police social distancing or whatnot. That takes money and time. This is important because often they have fewer people and fewer resources to do this stuff with than the federal government does. And that means that their resources are already strained and they don't have that, like, they're likely to be less inclined to go into lockdown, even if they need it, because they don't feel they can enforce it without federal support. Second bit of framing, I think the federal government just has more money, whether it's through like federal taxes, just because of their sheer size, or because of the fact that they're able to literally print money or borrow money if they need to, which states cannot do that easily, especially in the case of like small states, like say Delaware, right? Why is this important? I think it's important because it means that even in Gov's case, where it's local governments making these decisions, the federal government has to subsidize their lockdown. They have to pay for people to like not receive their wages and stay at home, for furlough schemes and so on and so forth. I think, therefore, we'll show you now how this becomes so much better when it's the federal government itself that has made this decision in two ways, right? Firstly, if it's the federal government that says you people will go into lockdown and you guys can't work because we've shut restaurants, they have to back that up by saying, but we'll support you, because they have like an electoral incentive to like stay in power and be elected, not be massively unpopular. But also I think it's usually like part of the same announcement, right? You're like, we're shutting you down and here's the money or stimulus package that you'll get for supporting it. I think on the other side, when the announcements come from different places, there's a lot of discussion that takes place behind the scenes and after the fact. I mean, the federal government, who obviously don't want to spend a lot of money, especially when it's not their decision, have an incentive to downplay that and give them less money. Look, for example, at how like the UK government is giving less money to Scotland for support, or Wales, because they made those decisions themselves without the support of Boris Johnson. Secondly, I think the federal government has an incentive to be more vindictive in those cases, right? If their policies clash, or if the local state government just says, we don't agree with the federal policies, we will lock down despite like guidance not to, that is when they have an incentive not to do that. Look at what happened like in the US over the summer, where Trump basically gave no support to Democratic governors shutting down their states to save lives, right? I think saving lives is like probably a primary objective in this debate. Correct me if I'm wrong, OG. Why is this important? I think it's important in three key ways. Firstly, more money for people who don't have wages and they're able to live. Good. Secondly, there's like fewer costs on the local population because the expenses are less centralized, right? At the point at which you still shut down 3 or 4 states that are more epidemiologically like suffering, but the cost is spread through taxes among the entire population. No like individual set of people in a local area suffers, so they're able to rebuild after the pandemic. But also thirdly, I think it stops things like capital flight, like companies leaving a particular state because it's shut down to go to a different one, because the federal government is more able to offer incentives like lower taxes and so on to keep these states and stop other states from going, we will never lock down, so all the companies can come to us and flock here with their money, killing people. I think the federal government can very easily put an end to that. I'll take a POI from CG before I move on if you have one. Nope, that's all right. Cool, moving on. Second argument, how people are more likely to follow rules on our side. note that even when the rules are similar in different states, you still have things like different details, whether it's like a different upper limit on how many people you can meet, whether it's 6 or 10, or whether it's like differences in wording, like you can call things the mask mandate, or I don't know, the wear a mask rule, stay at home. There are like so many buzzwords that we've seen be so different around the world and within the US, even with like different states. Why is this bad? It's bad for 3 reasons. Firstly, because broadcasters tend to be centralized, or at least the popular ones tend to be centralized, whether it's like the BBC or whatever equivalent exists in any country, people don't get the specific details that apply in their area. I think when it's a federal government that makes these decisions, it's likely that even if the rules are different per area, they're likely to use the same kind of language, the same kind of tiered system like we saw in the UK, which means that people are likely to get better information, but be better able to follow it. Secondly, I think at the point at which people find information confusing due to these missing details, they're likely to go, oh, I don't know exactly what the case is. I'll just like generally social distance, but I won't necessarily keep a 2 meter distance. I might keep a 1 meter distance because that makes sense to me. I think at that point, obviously, more people die because the people who make these decisions centrally make these decisions based on like scientific data, not just the general gut feeling of what social distancing should look like. But also, thirdly, I think boundaries between states are not necessarily always clear, particularly in the case of small states that function around a similar metro area, like say the New York City metro area, meaning that people have to cross these boundaries, and when the rules change in such a confusing way, they're less likely to follow them even if they want to. I think that's bad. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank that member for the remarks, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to close off the opening government case. Hear, hear.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. I'm just going to request that for POIs, if people are okay, if you can just raise your voice or maybe switch on your camera. I probably will not get to the chat, but I'll try my best to. Okay, setting my timer just a second. Look, I think that opening opposition starts out with a lot of rhetoric about how we've misunderstood this motion, about how it's like about policy making and not enforcement and things like that. I want to first deal with a clarification of our stance on opening government, but then deal with some rebuttal and a bit of extension, a bit of elaboration on the trade-off argument that Rebecca gave you in her first speech, okay? But firstly, to deal with this clarification, right? So they come up with this rhetoric that they are fine with regional lockdowns as long as they're implemented by a centralized government, and that they're like okay if the centralized government takes the policy decisions, even if the lockdowns themselves are regional, right? 3 responses. Firstly, we tell you that governments in general, centralized governments, are less informed about the regional situations than regional governments are, which means they're probably less capable to to give out lockdown decisions as per required basis as compared to regional governments. But secondly, we tell you that centralized governments are still going to need like congressional parliamentary approval to get these decisions through, which means that we still access the efficacy impacts that we get on our side when we tell you that regional governments are more effective in implementing these lockdown decisions. But lastly, we tell you that these centralized governments are still going to face backlash and that we still access all of the impacts that Rebecca gave you to that point in the sense that people are going to be like less trusting of the government in general if they think that they aren't being able to like treat these regions as well as they should be. But then in terms of like rebuttal, right, I want to first deal with the point that like regional governments have fewer resources or personnel than centralized governments. Look, this is simple math, right? Regional governments have fewer resources and personnel to deal with in smaller spaces, which means that they're more likely to be able to like give out these resources to the people who really need it or the people they are personally held responsible to. But secondly, we tell you that like some regions actually lose out because federal or centralized governments are forced to prioritize these regions between one another, which means that regional governments are at least allowed to use the few resources they have in their individual populations, as opposed to the centralized government saying like region 1 is more important than region 2, so we should focus our resources on region 1, leaving region 2 to like basically deteriorate. We tell you that we get more effective implementation of the lockdown policy on our side. But secondly, if they're so concerned about funding, we tell you that like regional governments are still able to access federal funding. We don't think that this is a concern that really matters in the weighing of this debate. But then secondly, we get this idea of like them stopping capital flight and like how companies are going to move from state to state if we allow regional governments to like take these decisions as opposed to the centralized government, right? Firstly, we tell you that this is a little bit unclear because if they still allow regional lockdowns to happen, even if a centralized government is implementing it, capital flight is something that occurs on their side of the house too. We don't see how this is unique to our side. But in order to deal with it, I'll tell you 2 things. Firstly, the capital flight is on the general unlikely to happen simply because companies have fixed costs in terms of the land they they own, the business they own, the labor they have. And it's unlikely that they're going to just up and shift because of the pandemic, especially given safety and health concerns in the pandemic. But secondly, even if they do that, we tell you that the comparative is that people stay in the same state and they're likely to lose jobs, and like their companies are likely to go bankrupt. And it's even worse in situations in which they don't actually need to, because their region is relatively better off. If regional governments are able to like take decisions based on the needs of their particular region, that means that lockdowns are likely to be less prolonged, and instead just be like particular to that, like specific to that particular region, meaning that people are like less likely to face like risks to their business and things like that, right? So then we come down to the idea that like the centralized government is just like better able to handle the implementation of the lockdown policy in general. Here we get a bit of distinction or a bit of like weird clarification from their part on whether it's like policy making or enforcement. We just want to clarify that to the extent to which we're talking about lockdown policy decisions in this debate, we also are responsible for talking about the enforcement of those policy decisions, because it would be redundant otherwise. To that end, we tell you that like we get more effective lockdown policies in terms of like stopping pandemics, simply because we like actually affect the individual behavior. Rebecca gives you really good warranting for like why this is important to look at, right? We think that like a pandemic is not going to go away unless we are able to influence the people into like adhering to the policies, wearing a mask, social distancing, that kind of thing. To the extent to which like you implement a lockdown in regions that don't actually need a lockdown, we tell you that people are likely to stop trusting the government, or at least feel a little bit disappointed or like angered against the government. We tell you this has a lot of long-term impacts in terms of like people not unwilling to take vaccinations and things like that, simply because they don't trust the government's like response to the pandemic. We tell you that this is really bad because it like raises the risks of safety and health in the country, but more importantly that it's actually extremely harmful for the economy itself. So when we come down to that point, we tell you that like tailored lockdowns mean that you're like helping the economy. Not only do you ensure that you don't shut down the entire economy all at once, but you do ensure that like vulnerable stakeholders are better protected, which means like people or the government is able to like or regional governments are able to like stop and start industries as they see fit, or as they need in their particular region. So then we come down to this idea of like trade-off, right? Rebecca leaves you with this idea that like a state is able to better focus on like detailed implementation than the national level, right? We tell you that this is extremely important because at the end of the day, the national government is responsible for coordinating the supply chain, like getting companies to mass produce like PPE suits and things like that, passing out stimulus packages and things like that, right? We tell you that to that extent, that state governments are better able to focus on what their people need in those particular regions, right? We tell you that the state governments are able to like look at what kind of like restaurants should be open, for instance, or like implement policies that are better suited to what the people need in that lockdown. We tell you that this gives the national government a better opportunity to deal with COVID in the long term, right? Or like any pandemic, it gives them a better opportunity to not just implement a lockdown until you need the next lockdown, but in order to deal with the pandemic as a whole. And we think that we've seen examples of countries that have done this effectively, and that's because they have like really good like regional implementation or legislative bodies as well. So on the whole, we tell you that like in the debate, OG has given you extremely good like reasoning or warranting for why we effectively deal with the pandemic, not just in the short term and not just in the sense that we're like implementing a lockdown in order to like cull the pandemic or reduce the effect of it, but in the long term where we actually give the government an opportunity to like deal with the long-term effects of this, and also ensure that like people are more inclined to work with the government in order to like cull the pandemic as a whole. We tell you that because we access those benefits on our side, that OG takes this. Thank you so much.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close off the top half of today's debate here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Panel, I think the responses we got to the case we brought to you in OO was pitiful. They said that centralized governments are just going to be less informed about the regional areas. I have three responses to this. Firstly, I just think it's literally their fucking job to be informed, but also they just have more workers generally and can communicate with local councils. And therefore, at that point, I think they probably just are able to be informed. But secondly, I think it's incredibly easy to see the the stats, because you're literally just looking at the rate of infection, which is just one number. So I think it's very easy to actually assess whether or not you need to implement different lockdown policies, because that is the only real metric you actually need in order to decide whether a state should be locked down or not. And therefore, I think that response falls out of this debate. What I'm going to do is firstly rebut their case, then move on to responses from Georges, and finally just impact and explain to you why these are the debate-winning impacts in this case. I have two responses to them. Firstly, to their point about centralized governments being less effective. They have 4 reasons for this. The first reason is there can be like less affirmative action or issues for minorities. I think a lot of this is irrelevant in a pandemic, because I don't think, firstly, they're going to be listened to regardless, and secondly, I don't think that their issues are necessarily as salient in relation to a pandemic. The second reason they give you is that there is an incentive for governments to underreport or represent cases. I think that's completely symmetric to local governments, who also will probably want to underrepresent their levels. But secondly, I think that the media loves to criticize the government. That's the entire purpose of the media. But I just don't think they care about local governments as much, because as George explained to you, media tends to be centralized. People watch the BBC or CNN. They don't look at their random local radio station or news station. And therefore, at that point, I think firstly, you get less criticism of regional governments, which is probably just bad in terms of informing them. But secondly, I think you get less publicity of the actual policies which are implemented by the local governments, because of the fact that CNN just literally doesn't have the time to actually say what the policies are in every single different state. And the impact of this, which we got no response to, is that people actually follow the policies less because they are less able to actually access it. I don't think the majority of people who just want to get on with their lives and don't necessarily care that much are actually going to bother to find the random local news station which is publicizing the regional restrictions. I think more what they want to do is just tune in to one news station and find all the information they need to know. And I think that's much more likely to happen at the point at which you have a centralized government who can say all of these regions have this policy, rather than having to have each specific individual regional government have minor adjustments within them. The third reason they give is that, well, the centralized government can't afford to lock down all areas at once. I think that because it's national, they don't necessarily have to, because George explained to you why you can actually lock down regions even as a centralized government. But also, I think more importantly, now the costs are dispersed, because the states which aren't in lockdown can be used to fund the states which are. They say, well, it's bad for like some certain states to have to fund other ones which are in lockdown. I think that fundamentally the most vulnerable people in this are the people who have the highest level of pandemic, because they're the ones who are most likely to be suffering financially, most likely to be suffering in terms of their healthcare. And so I think it's just net better for the most vulnerable people if the states which aren't in lockdown are subsidizing the ones which are. The final reason they give you is that people will be fed up and therefore they won't follow it. I think that is utterly symmetric regardless, because people probably get fed up on either side of the house. The difference is, I think that it's seen as more serious when the centralized government is telling you what the policies are, and you are just probably more able to understand what the policies you're meant to be following are in the first place. And so even if you are fed up, you're just more likely to actually know what the policies are you're meant to be following, rather than just never actually engaging with what those are. The second argument they give you is that there's a trade-off between coordinating policies like for regional lockdowns and things like stimulus packages. The first thing I want to say is that centralized governments have things like an economics and finance ministry in the government whose whole job is just to focus on things like stimulus packages. And so I think it is very easy for other parts of the government to be focusing on where should we be having the restrictions, like the healthcare sector or just like the actual executive branch. And so I think that it's just easy for them to do this. But secondly, I think George explained to you why the federal government specifically is going to be heavily overburdened, and they don't have the manpower to deal with this extra capacity of having to decide on the policies. And that's because they have to do things like distribute food to the people who are in isolation. They have to police the lockdown, but also they have to do things like man local testing centers. And given the fact they don't have the resources in the status quo, because they don't have an economics ministry within these local governments, they are less able to actually be able to manage the lockdown policies as well, which either means you get worse other policies, so you get less distribution of food, or you get less good policies in the first place, which is also net harm. What were their responses to George's case? I think they broadly had three. The first is that local governments have less area to like man, and therefore it doesn't matter, they have less resources. I think firstly, I don't really care if certain areas are better off if we're actually harming the most vulnerable areas, which i.e. are the areas with the highest level of COVID at that time. But secondly, I think it is just much more easy for them to be overwhelmed, because they can't do things like take out a massive loan like they can do if they are the centralized government, because the centralized government has the the authority to do that. And therefore, I think that if they do become overwhelmed, it is just less likely that they're able to actually do anything about it. But secondly, they say that capital flight won't be able to happen. I think the difference is the politicization, right? Because if certain states are able to do it at a regional level, they say we are never going to lock down ever. And this means that capital is likely to go there because they've said they will never lock down. And I think they are likely actually to care about capital because they care about the local economy potentially more than they do about the wider economy. Whereas I think that as a centralized government, you can't say that you're never going to lock down X state because that seems really weird and you have no incentive to do that. And therefore, at that point, I think you just get less politicization of these issues altogether. And therefore, this is why I think our impacts are debate winning, because we explain why you get less politicization. I'll take a POI if they have one. Okay, I guess no one has a POI. So the differences in politicization is this, that at the point at which there is less clash with different parties, because if you have a different party at the centralized government versus the federal level, then you have the politicization of things like masks, because the regional governments which mandated mask wearing will essentially use that as a political tool to beat the head over the centralized government, which means that they don't actually do things like mandate mask wearing because they see it as a concession to the regional governments who are from a different party, or they see it as like a humiliating U-turn. This just doesn't happen at the point at which the centralized government has been consistently mandating the policy throughout the entirety, because there is less ability for it to have been politicized in the first place. What I think this means is this extends to things like mask wearing, because people see this as less of a political issue. That's really important in terms of controlling the pandemic. Secondly, I think that more people follow the policies overall, which protects the most vulnerable. Firstly, in terms of the length of the pandemic, but also reduces the harm to the economy, which also helps vulnerable people in the future. And finally, because the costs are distributed, I think certain areas are just going to be less harmed financially for years after, because their council had to spend more during the pandemic. So because we provide you the most important impacts, and I don't think they have anything left standing, so proud to oppose.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I